And now the Deeper Thinking Podcast, a daily exploration into how philosophy, psychology, and technology shape how we think, feel, and live.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. Somewhere in that landscape, before language fully arrived, a philosophy was forming. Not in the abstract, but in the bodily knowledge of enough. Enough warmth to stay out longer. Enough distance to feel alone without being abandoned. Enough sound to drown out the need for questions. The stick didn't need to be a symbol. It was a stick. The fence didn't need to be a boundary. It was a drum. These were not metaphors then. They were real, tactile affirmations that the world had corners and textures and rhythms that could be interacted with, even controlled for a moment. That sense of shaping and being shaped is what lingers. What returns when the weather turns cool and the light begins to bend. And perhaps it's that interplay that defines so much of adult longing. Not for the leaf piles themselves, but for the moment before interpretation, the time before everything had to mean something. When joy could be instantaneous, when a zip was not about concealment but containment, when the snugness of fabric against the face didn't suggest withdrawal but safety. Adults don't outgrow this need, they just displace it. Into rituals, devices, curated solitude. But the yearning remains, to be cold and then warm, to be alone and not lonely, to be witnessed but not required to respond. Mum was never a command, she was a presence, sometimes not even in sight but implied, built into the fabric of the moment like a watermark you can only see from a certain angle. And when she did appear, perhaps just her voice calling from the doorway or the sound of the heater clicking on inside, it wasn't an interruption, but a tether. Not dragging you back, but confirming you had a place to return to. That's the part that sinks deepest. Not the play, not the kick, not even the stick on the fence, but the knowledge that at any point you could walk back through the door and find everything slightly steamed up from the kettle, and your name still intact in someone else's mouth. It's strange how easily these details are forgotten until a smell or a temperature or a muffled sound retrieves them. As if the memory lives not in the mind, but in the fingertips, the breath, the skin, under the scarf. And when they do come back, it's not the past being relived, it's the architecture of early knowing being felt again, wordless, sure, and whole. What if the most enduring truths of who we are weren't learned through speech, but through rhythm, through the way cold air moves across the face, through the memory of wet gloves, through the shape of a silence that holds rather than leaves? This essay is a meditation on how early experiences of texture, temperature, and quiet autonomy form not just memory but selfhood. It asks what remains of a childhood morning long after the facts have faded, what persists not as story but as structure. Through the lens of a single walk to school in autumn, it explores how sensory repetition, spatial care, and unnoticed rituals imprint themselves into the psyche. Philosophical ideas are not named here, but they are lived. Merleau-Ponty's embodied perception, Gendlin's felt sense, Bachelard's poetics of space, and Irigarei's ethics of presence all echo through the fabric of this memory. The mother figure, almost absent, is rendered as architectural care. The fence, the fog, and the cold are not background, they are epistemological. This is not an essay about childhood as innocence or nostalgia or loss. It is about childhood as form, about what the body knows before the mind understands, and how, even years later, we continue to move through the world using a grammar built from those earliest walks, one tap of the stick, one breath of fog, one zipped hood at a time. The world narrowed to a tunnel, not in fear but in comfort, a circle of wool drawn tightly around the face, not to keep the world out, but to allow just enough of it in. The hood zipped to the nose, the gloves too thick to pick anything up, the coat tight in the arms, not restricting but holding. Autumn was not a season, it was a kind of architecture. Yellow and brown, not as symbols of death, but as the palette of permission. To be alone, to be small. To make music from fences with a stick found on the path, to hear the percussion of wood on iron and know it belonged to no one else. There was no audience, no judgment, only the rhythm, the cold, the crackle underfoot. Safety wasn't spoken, it was felt in the layers, the slight pinch of the coat buttons, the damp wool smell, the breath warming the zipped-up pocket of air, Brittle things crumple with each step a celebration. Trees let go, and the ground welcomed the evidence. A child doesn't interpret this as loss. A child hears it as invitation. Run, kick, feel the air open, make your own sound. There is no metaphor in the moment, only memory later, and even that gets soft at the edges. But one thing remains, the gaze through the small round frame of a woolen tunnel, grey sky above, leaf swirl below, somewhere nearby a presence, quiet, maternal, structural, not hovering, not explaining, just there. Mum? No great declarations, no life lessons, just the knowledge that if you fell, there was someone nearby who had already seen it coming. The sound of her boots was part of the percussion too, though you didn't know it then. There is no profound truth in autumn, except that it allowed for stillness while moving, solitude without danger. A circle within which you could observe the world without being pulled into it. This is how some people come to understand love, not through words or warmth, but through the precise geometry of a zipped-up hood, through the dignity of being left alone while still being protected, through the quiet permissions of someone who stood nearby without ever asking you to perform. It's easy to forget how much of early life is architectural, not just places, but textures, enclosures, the microclimates of coats and corners. The memory of autumn isn't just emotional, it's spatial. It's the closeness of the inside world and the vastness of the outer one, and the exact seam where they meet. That seam for a child might be a zip. It might be the border of a scarf that tickles the chin. It might be a door frame where a mother pauses before calling you in. These moments shape the inner architecture, the blueprint of safety and attention. Not the grand gestures of care, but the steady ambient signals. A warm meal appearing without announcement, gloves retrieved from a drawer without fanfare. Love, before we can name it, often looks like preparation done quietly. And it sets a rhythm, a hum we carry forward, even as the gloves change and the sticks get left behind. There's a kind of percussion to memory too. The tap of feet on pavement, the rustle of leaves, the echo of a stick against a fence. These sounds don't just fill the air, they fill the self. As if the child is building something with each step, not just movement, but measure. Not just noise, but music, a way of saying I am here without ever needing to speak. There is no performance, no gaze to intercept the gesture, just the pure articulation of being alive in a body that is curious, warm, and slightly too bundled. Some people spend decades trying to reclaim that combination, the freedom to move and the freedom to be held, to be visible without being watched, to be accompanied without being asked to explain. That's what autumn gave. That's what the zipped hood and the damp wool preserved. Not nostalgia for its own sake, but a kind of atmospheric memory, an ecosystem of safety. And yet, it is not only comfort. There's a loneliness threaded through it. Not painful, but intrinsic. The world didn't need you. It went on raining and leafing and blowing, but you belonged in it anyway. You were not the centre, and you didn't need to be. In the smallest ways, generous. A stick, a fence, a sound, a mother near enough to catch you if you ran too far. The choreography of early freedom, set to the rustle of leaves and the distant rhythm of someone waiting. Somewhere in that landscape, before language fully arrived, a philosophy was forming. Not in the abstract, but in the bodily knowledge of enough. Enough warmth to stay out longer. Enough distance to feel alone without being abandoned. Enough sound to drown out the need for questions. The stick didn't need to be a symbol, it was a stick. The fence didn't need to be a boundary, it was a drum. These were not metaphors then. They were real. Tactile affirmations that the world had corners and textures and rhythms that could be interacted with, even controlled for a moment. That sense of shaping and being shaped is what lingers, what returns when the weather turns cool and the light begins to bend. And perhaps it's that interplay that defines so much of adult longing, not for the leaf piles themselves, but for the moment before interpretation, the time before everything had to mean something. When joy could be instantaneous, when a zip was not about concealment but containment, when the snugness of fabric against the face didn't suggest withdrawal but safety. Adults don't outgrow this need, they just displace it, into rituals, devices, curated solitude. But the yearning remains, to be cold and then warm, to be alone and not lonely, to be witnessed but not required to respond. Mum was never a command, she was a presence, sometimes not even in sight, but implied. Built into the fabric of the moment, like a watermark you can only see from a certain angle. And when she did appear, perhaps just her voice calling from the doorway, or the sound of the heater clicking on inside, it wasn't an interruption but a tether. Not dragging you back, but confirming you had a place to return to. That's the part that sinks deepest. Not the play, not the kick, not even the stick on the fence, but the knowledge that, at any point, you could walk back through the door and find everything slightly steamed up from the kettle, and your name still intact in someone else's mouth. It's strange how easily these details are forgotten until a smell or a temperature or a muffled sound retrieves them. As if the memory lives not in the mind but in the fingertips, the breath, the skin under the scarf. And when they do come back, it's not the past being relived, it's the architecture of early knowing being felt again, wordless, sure, and whole. There's a quiet danger in how gently these memories reside. They don't press themselves forward. They don't insist on being told. They wait, folded into corners of the self that only open under the right conditions, a cold wind through a narrow gap in the coat, the scratch of wool against cheek, a certain angle of grey sky that matches the light in a childhood photograph you don't even remember being taken. And when they do arrive, they don't come as stories. They come as temperature, texture, a kind of internal shift, as if your body, not your mind, is the one that remembers. It's this bodily memory that becomes a kind of compass. You find yourself, later in life, chasing the same atmospheres, not the events, but the arrangements. A walk where no one expects a destination. A room made small by soft light and silence. A gesture from someone who lets you be. You don't always recognize the pattern immediately, but when it settles, there's relief, not the kind that shouts, the kind that exhales, that says, this is familiar, this is home. Not in geography, but in rhythm. And then there's Mum, always in the background of these memories, not as a protagonist, but as a kind of architecture too. The world she built allowed for these small freedoms, allowed you to be both safe and separate, not watched, but held in the margins. She didn't overreach. She let you kick leaves and draw breath and listen to your own footsteps. That kind of presence becomes the blueprint for trust, not just in others, but in the world, in the idea that you can move freely and still be remembered, still be known. As adults, we often seek out explanations for who we are. We want language, theory, maps. But sometimes the answer is not a sentence, it's a sound, a weight, the rustle of leaves under a thick boot, the zip drawn slowly up to the chin, the way the world shrinks, not in fear but in clarity, a hood as a lens, a coat as a cocoon, autumn as a ritual of return. These are not just your happiest memories. They are the memories that made happiness legible, that gave it shape and form, so that later, when life got wider and more uncertain, you could still recognize it, still seek it. Still, in some quiet way, build it. The hood was always zipped to the nose, a narrow circle of wool made just wide enough for seeing, for breathing. I was a child. Inside it, the world was smaller, kinder. The cold didn't bite, it shaped. The gloves were thick and clumsy, the coat tight across the shoulders in a way that felt like permission. To move, to pause, to belong to the air. Autumn was not an event, it was a structure. It rearranged the world into a place where stillness could happen without explanation. The leaves no longer tried to be golden. They curled and darkened and broke like quiet paper. Some gave way underfoot with a crackle, others simply collapsed. Each step delivered an answer. Every fence post, a percussion. I ran the stick along the rails like pressing a button just to see the light blink, like checking the world was still there. It didn't feel like walking. It felt like a conversation. The frost was not a signal of ending, but an act of attention. It edged the wet leaves with a bright outline, as if the world was trying to show its shape. I paused to look at one once, a single brown leaf with white crystal teeth. It didn't teach me anything, it just stayed there. And somehow, that was enough. My socks were already wet. Not from a mistake, but a decision I didn't remember making. The puddle was there, and then it wasn't, and now my toes were carrying its memory. I didn't complain. That wasn't the shape of the morning. Everything had weight, the gloves, the breath, the silence between my footsteps. The darkness hadn't lifted yet, but it wasn't frightening. It was holding, like the space before music starts. The sky was a flat sheet of grey, not heavy, not light, just there, waiting. Mum was somewhere behind, but not close. She didn't hover. That was part of the gift. She let me walk ahead, allowed the space between us to stretch without breaking. I didn't look back. But I knew she had seen the socks, had maybe sighed and said nothing, that she had laid the gloves out before I woke, that she would have zipped the coat for me if I'd asked, but I didn't. It mattered somehow to do it myself. The world didn't know my name, but she did. And she didn't need to say it. That morning, like so many others, I walked into the cold, not to arrive anywhere, but to feel the shape of being alive. Not watched, but remembered. Not warmed, but known. There was a kind of choreography to it all. Not learned exactly, but lived into. The way I stepped around the slickest patch of concrete without needing to look. The moment I paused before the second gate, not because I was told, but because I always did. These gestures weren't taught. They were absorbed. My body knew them long before I would have called them memory. They were part of the architecture, like the way the house exhaled warmth through the letterbox. Like the way Mum's footsteps never hurried, even when we were late. Sometimes the cold would bite sharper, wind that worked its way under the collar, the raw shock of breath drawn too deep, and I'd flinch just once, then steady again. That's the thing about being a child. You recover quickly, but you remember differently. Not in stories, but in texture. The cold didn't register as cruelty. It just meant I was real, that I had skin. That something outside me could touch me and not break me. And there was something about the light, what little there was, that changed the way things felt. A softness to the shadows, a gentleness in how the morning held back. The world seemed less certain, but also less demanding. No glare, no rush. Even the sound of the stick on the fence felt quieter in that light. I wasn't performing. I wasn't seeking. I was just making contact with the metal, with the rhythm, with the day. I used to wonder what Mum did when I wasn't looking, whether she watched me from the window or just moved into her own morning with the same steadiness she offered mine, but I never turned back to check. There was something sacred in not needing to. That distance wasn't emptiness. It was structure. A field I moved within, shaped by her quiet preparation. The gloves laid out, the toast that appeared, the unsaid instructions folded into every part of the routine. I followed without thinking, not because I was obedient, but because I trusted what was there. There were no declarations, no lessons spoken aloud, just the slow, repeating gestures of care that formed the shape of our mornings. And in that shape, I learned things I didn't yet know how to name. That silence can be steadying. That distance can be love. That frost, when it settles gently, does not freeze everything. It outlines what matters. It makes it visible. Just long enough to notice, then gone. The air shifted again near the crossing. Not just in temperature, but in sound. That stretch always carried a low mechanical rattle. Engines idling, distant hums, the occasional cough of a car too cold to start cleanly. I never minded it. It wasn't a city, not really. Just a few cars on their way to school, like me. Still the sound settled over everything. A soft industrial rhythm beneath the breath of the morning. White-grey exhaust fumes puffed out into the fog, hanging low, then folding back into the mist. I breathed it in without thinking. It didn't feel wrong. It felt like part of the routine. Like coat, like scarf, like stick. Just one more layer between me and the day. The lights at the crossing blinked through the fog. Slow and indifferent. I waited without touching the button. It never really mattered. Traffic was sparse. The gesture was the point, a kind of punctuation. I stood still until the road felt quiet, then moved, counting steps across painted lines like keys on a piano I wasn't learning to play. On the other side, the pavement narrowed. The fence returned, but shorter, lower, not right for tapping. I held the stick loosely now. Its role was done. I didn't throw it away. That felt wasteful. Instead, I shifted it from hand to hand like a thought I wasn't quite ready to finish. I looked at the front gardens. Some neat, some forgotten. One with a bike half sunk into the hedge. Tyres soft, chain rusted through. I stared at it every morning. Not because I wanted it, but because it hadn't moved. There was something comforting in that. The noise of cars stayed just behind me, low, constant, just present enough to mark time. I didn't resist it. I let it blend into the morning. It filled the space where my mind might have wandered. Instead of questions, I listened. The crunch of gravel under tyres, a door thudding closed, the squeak of a brake not yet warmed, ordinary sounds. Reliable, like the pulse of a place not in a hurry. I passed the brick wall where frost always clung longer than anywhere else. I touched it once, just to see. My fingers came away dry but cold. I didn't press again. Some things are better left to keep their stillness. Then the school gate appeared. Not suddenly, but with a kind of slow inevitability. It didn't mark an ending, just a shift, a gentle folding of the walk into whatever came next. I didn't sigh. I didn't brace. I just walked in. You didn't know it then, but the mornings were teaching you something close to reverence. Not the loud kind, not ritual or faith or doctrine, just the soft practice of noticing. The condensation on the inside of the window pane, where a fingertip might draw a circle. The way the steam from toast rose like a signal, curling up through the strip of morning light that finally arrived around the curtain's edge. The way the world waited, for you, for itself. Even school didn't quite break it. The walk there mattered more, the crunch of ice on the grass, the faint tang of metal from the gate, the breath cloud of the person walking just ahead. Everything observed from inside your own zipped-up world. The hood narrowed your field of vision, but deepened it too. You weren't missing anything. You were focused. Even the discomfort was intimate. Damp socks were miserable, yes, but they were also real. They meant you'd stepped somewhere without calculation, that you'd been too absorbed to notice. There's a kind of pride in that, in the unplanned wetness of childhood, in the risk of not quite being dry. You'd learn to look out for puddles later. But for now, you were busy. Busy with the sound of the path, the crack of a twig, the fact that some leaves crumbled to dust beneath your feet, while others held their shape until the last second. Each one a little decision. Each one a conversation between time, temperature, and touch. And then there were the dark mornings, monolithic, weighty, still. They didn't feel sad, they felt secret, like the world hadn't started yet, and you had it to yourself for a while. You could look at things more slowly, you could hear your own footsteps echo. That echo taught you something too, that you could make a mark, that you were real, that you were moving even in stillness. This is how a soul shapes itself before it learns to speak. In the quiet, in the cold, in the small acts that no one else sees. Not in the performances, not in the triumphs, but in the mute choreography of leaf, stick, boot, breath. And in the presence of a woman who asked nothing but saw everything. Who didn't name your world for you but helped build its borders. Who let you walk through it, zipped up, damp-footed, quiet and whole. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Today's episode was narrated by Holly, our digital narrator, who helps bring our ideas to life. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help keep us visible so others can discover and enjoy our content.